I've found some of the most intelligent people I've met in my life in finance make terrible rookie errors when emotions get involved, particularly when you're underwater, right? Particularly when you're facing a loss and then how to deal with that loss.
Welcome to the HKUST MBA Superconnector podcast. This episode's guest is Professor Paul Kitney. Paul teaches macroeconomics in our MBA program. He brings over 30 years of research-based and practitioner experience to our classroom. He has been an investment strategist at Morgan Stanley, Daiwa Securities, and BlackRock. Paul's PhD in economics is from the Australia National University. If his voice sounds familiar to you, you may have heard him as a guest expert interviewed on Bloomberg, CNBC, or other financial media. This is the second section of a two-part podcast. In this section, we get to know Paul at a more personal level. Paul and I discuss how and why he made his transition from investing in Hong Kong Central to teaching future leaders the ins and outs of macroeconomics in Clearwater Bay. We also explore how Paul's lessons from investing inform his personal interest of trekking and mountain climbing. He also shares about his current reading list and his thinking on peak performance. If you are interested in more like this, please follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. I know you go into this in a lot more detail in your class, and you're able to explain more of the principles and the models here. I would like to shift gears, Paul, and just talk a bit about you and how you got into teaching. Tell us a little bit about your path to HKUST.
It's an unusual path. I kind of did things backwards. So I started off as an economics student in undergrad at the University of Sydney. I did really well. I won a scholarship for the top 6 students in the country, and that was a Reserve Bank scholarship, Reserve Bank of Australia. So they paid me my salary while I worked full-time in my final year, and they would have then taken me on to do a PhD at top Ivy League schools and so on at that time. And so I took on that scholarship, but I decided at the end of it that I wanted to work in finance instead. So I kind of sold out. But I never lost my passion for economics. But, I was, I suppose, a bit of a greedy young man back then. And so I moved into Wall Street. So I began a 30-year career working primarily in Asian equity markets. So I worked on the sell side. I worked on the buy side. Some of the sell side firms I worked for were Morgan Stanley, side BlackRock. I worked on the buy side as well at firms such as T. Rowe, but also in the hedge fund industry. So at Morgan Stanley, for example, I worked in their internal hedge fund. And based on my performance there, I was able to join a large US hedge fund called Whitney, and then perform well, and then spun that off into my own startup hedge fund called Bronte Investment Management, which I ran for a number of years, and then ran into the global financial crisis. And the global financial crisis occurred. Actually, my fund was up during 2008, but capital raising was a challenge in 2009. And I made the difficult decision to close it down. And then that was 2009, and I took the first pause in my life to sort of contemplate my future. And it was then trek in Nepal, Everest Base Camp. And it gave me the sort of the perspective to think laterally about my career. And I thought I never stopped my interest in economics. I did a master's degree, an MSc in economics in the late 90s. I never lost my interest. I was toying with the idea of doing a PhD, but I was so obsessed with my career. But it was in that moment I said, this is my last chance to do it. And so I reconnected with my former boss at the RBA, who happened to be head of department of econ at the ANU, and he said, welcome back. So I embarked on a PhD in 2010, graduated in 2015, and I looked for some academic jobs at that point. I didn't find it what I wanted straight away because I was restricted to Hong Kong. My family, etc., were here. So I worked in finance at Daiwa at that time. And then I got an opportunity to teach part-time as an adjunct associate professor, then adjunct professor at Chinese University of Hong Kong Business School. And then just prior to COVID, they offered me a position to be professor of practice in finance and economics in their business school in 2020, and I jumped at it. I worked with them for 3 years, had a great experience with the teaching. I've always enjoyed teaching. I always felt that with my employees
Yep.
in the workplace or colleagues and what have you, that teaching was an important part of my role. And people would come to me and people would tell me, well, you explained that really well. And so I suppose I had sort of a natural aptitude for it, but I also enjoyed doing it. And so, for me, I've come to a certain point in my life where, working in finance and making that incremental buck is far less important to me than it is now for a legacy and contributing to the next generation. And now I feel like I can give back a bit. Before it was a career. Now I feel for the first time in my life, it's a vocation. And I feel blessed about that.
Yeah, and it comes out in the classroom. I hear just great reviews from our students. They just feel like they really learn a ton in your class, but also enjoy it. And yet, you're also known as a professor that has high standards. So it's that profile that we do look for. Sometimes we call it the warm demander, right? We got to have high expectations, high standards, but having that empathy and that support for students as well. So your background that you described, practice, running your own hedge fund, advising, lots of being a researcher as well, understanding the real behind the scenes research. Tell me, how does some of that experience inform how you teach and how has it impacted what you bring into the classroom? So the professional side as well as the research side and your personal experience.
Okay, well, let's take it up one by one.
Yeah.
So in terms of my professional practice, I teach some courses that are very academic, technical maths and coding stuff that's much more related to my academic research. On the other hand, I teach some practical courses that are very much related to my industry experience. So in the MBA program, I teach a course called Global Macro. That's kind of a blend between the two. That one there is, we try not to get too technical, but try to be relevant enough and not just talk about case studies from 20 or 30 or 100 years ago, but try to look at the real world as it is to give the students a certain amount of tool set to be able to analyze that world for themselves. I guide them through sort of key current events. Yes, we do use some case studies to illustrate certain theory, but to a large degree, it's looking at the real world, stuff that's visible to them in real time, and then to help develop their independence to do that. Now, what that does require is some theory. And I make no apologies. And I'd say in the first class, whenever I teach that course, is that you will need to learn some theory, because without that, you don't have a tool set to be able to analyze the real world. So you're right. My courses are not storytelling. They're very much getting them to, of course, I like to tell stories, but not just storytelling. How about that? But there needs to be something substantial for them to learn for their own independent research that they'll do going forward. And I can do that without getting too technical. Okay. So that course there does blend some of the real world and practical stuff that I would do as an economist or strategist or portfolio manager in real, less so on the investment, but more in terms of the macro side. Macro investment strategy in practice, which is another MBA course I teach, that one is very much related to practice. So if that one is, we take the next step from global macro, and what we do is we say, okay, now we understand, let's push our understanding of macro a little bit more, but then to understand what is the impact of different economic shocks and policy events on the behavior of equities, bonds, foreign exchange rates, maybe if we've got time, crypto and gold or what have you, right? And to understand and to think about how an investment process would work that takes into consideration macro. I mean, just one little anecdote is that statistical studies have shown the attribution to a single stock's performance or its return from country and sector selection is something around 70 to 80%. The idiosyncratic content, right, is really only 20 to 30%, right? Which means if you don't get your country or market and sector decision right, the macro, if you don't get it right, you need to be a really good stock picker. Okay, but guess what? In industry, professionals in industry, what do you think the employment ratio is? It's more like 80 to 90% on security selection, bond, credit analysts and so on, and very, very few people in macro. So here's the opportunity. If you can develop an understanding of how the macro impacts the performance of asset markets, you have an edge relative to the competition. So I bring that in and I teach some of my secret sauce. Teach them my investment process, right? Teach them how to think about an investment process, whether it comes to equities or bonds or FX. So it's a combination of those. Now, in some of the other more academically oriented courses, perhaps less so in MBA, but in others. So I teach even right up to PhD level. I teach a PhD second year course that teaches directly out of my research. So that is helping PhD students get to the frontier and then teaching them from stuff that I've actually published or looking to publish and teaching them the theory and the technical component of that. Now, there is trickle down, the really technical stuff into my MBA courses, because a lot of this stuff has to do with monetary policy. So I'm a macroeconomist with a monetary economics focus, primarily theory, but also empirical.
One of the things that I found fascinating getting to know you is your climbing mountains, trekking. You mentioned Everest. I think you've been all around the world on this. How did you get into that? And does it have you taken lessons from that experience into either developing your investment philosophy, your investment process, or your teaching process and philosophy? Tell us some more about that.
I got into it by accident. And I've given part of this story. So this was after I closed down my hedge fund towards the end of 2009. I went on that Everest Base Camp trek. And it was the first time, I think it was probably my wife and I think it was probably 7 years since we had a 2-week holiday. I was a workaholic. So I hadn't taken a day off, including Saturday or Sunday, for 3 years. People will say when you own your own business, you have freedom. That's not really true. You turn the lights on in the morning and you turn them off at night. And so it was the first time that I could actually stop, smell the roses, and actually really be thoughtful and lateral in terms of my thinking about my own future. And so I loved going to the mountains. There's something spiritual about it. There's something deeply peaceful. The simplicity of putting one foot ahead of the next. Sometimes, in thin air, you're gasping a little bit, but you get used to it. And that was really the catalyst. And so it started off with trekking. And then I went on 2 or 3 treks in different parts of Nepal. And then I talked to some people I met and they talked about, we climbed this mountain. I said, show me the photos. And the photos looked amazing. What I loved about trekking is that it's not, you don't get your views and sights handed to you on a silver platter. You can't have like a plane drop you there and then you can just take photos. You have to earn it. And there's something satisfying in owning it as a trekker. And what I found thereafter is that then what I did is that I went on my first climb. I took some mountaineering lessons, and it was a mountain called Imjatsu in Nepal, 21,000 feet. And it was magnificent. And when I made it, and I was absolutely exhausted, I think it was a 17-hour summit day. And then the views of 8,000 meter peaks from that. I mean, not many people get to see that. And then you really earn it. And the satisfaction you get from saying it, I was hooked. And then I took many courses there afterwards and then tried more challenging. I've climbed in Aconcagua in Argentina, the tallest volcano in the world, Ojos del Salado in Chile. I've climbed several mountains, technical mountains in Bolivia, South America, in the US, in the Northern Cascades, and of course in Nepal, and I've climbed there. And I've been on an Everest expedition. I've climbed in New Zealand, in the Southern Alps there as well, and absolutely love it. What lessons have I learned? I've learned a lot about risk management. So on almost every large expedition that I've been on, there's been either a very serious illness or death. And what I saw was it's a life lesson in decision making. When people get involved in these expeditions, a lot of them go into it with a notion, I spent a lot of money to be here. I spent a lot of time getting here. I'm going to make it to the top no matter what. A lot of type 1 personalities and so on. Now that's okay, so long as you have a risk management process. Now with me, I have a checklist. The first starts with myself. How am I feeling, right? How am I feeling relative to I felt we are on different climbs? I can see this with, with my breathing or, with my mental clarity. Mountain sickness is high altitude mountain sickness is a serious thing. So cerebral edema, which is when you get fluid on your brain that comes from being at high altitude when your body's not properly adjusting, or pulmonary edema, which is when you get fluid on your lungs for a similar reason, kill mountaineers every year. So for example, Concagua. First time I went there, we got to the highest camp. Okay, the highest camp was around 6,000 meters. That's about 20,000 feet. It's the summit is around 23,000 feet. And there were high winds and very, very poor visibility. And it was extremely cold. It's about minus 40 degrees at that point. And there was my group and there was another group. It was a North American group. And we talked amongst each other and we said, look, the risks are a bit too high. We can stay here for a bit longer, but if the weather doesn't improve, we better just go down. And in the end, we decided we're going to go down. But then we had this other group and they said, look, we don't know when we're going to be able to get back here again. We're going to push it. Okay. And they said, are you really sure? Here's the weather forecast and what have you. And there were two different groups, two different decisions, two completely different outcomes. We went straight back to our base camp and we're, drinking beer. By the end of the previous evening, they had a terrible night. One person from frostbite, another person had to be evac'd off the mountain with pulmonary edema. Another person almost died from related problems, completely different outcomes. So what do I look for? I look for a checklist. You make your decisions sort of based on what your risk tolerance is. So how well you're feeling, what the mountain conditions are, what weather conditions are. And there's a fourth one, other, right? What about different personality dynamics in your group? Do you have someone who in there is a particularly disruptive influence and that could impact? And I've decided to exit particular climbs based on that before and just say, look, life is too short. I would rather wait until all the ducks are aligned. If all the stars are aligned, I'll go for it. And I'll push myself. I'll push myself really hard if it's all aligned. But if it's not, it's just not worth it. There's inherent risk in mountaineering anyway. If you ignore observable risk, you're really asking for trouble. And it's only a matter of time before the mountain claims you. And I've seen this so many times. People who have, gone off and made summits. I remember actually on Ojos del Salvador in Chile, someone stumbling into camp with high altitude mountain sickness, right? And the high camp was at 5,000 and it's difficult there because it's actually physically a very long way from that point to the nearest hospital. And that person luckily survived. But I won't get into the morbid stuff about people dying, but it does happen.
Yeah, I can see how your the disciplined thinking, the investment philosophy of making sure that you're thinking through all the factors, how you can apply that as well to your
absolutely.
So
in some ways, it was the other way around.
Yeah, interesting.
In some ways, it was actually my risk management discipline that came from finance.
Yes.
That I brought into mountaineering.
Yeah,
and it was like I had my own checklist. I would, I would have stop losses. It's stop losses on individual positions, or sort of based on at the portfolio level, or what have you. It was kind of I brought that in to my mountaineering. I already had that approach where I could shut off. So I do this before I invest, or I do this before I go on a mountain. And I know what my checklist is. I don't make it up on the fly, and I don't violate that discipline. So I was used to that discipline. By the way, in finance, it took me a while to get that discipline, but I brought that into the mountaineering. And I suppose since then, with my own investing and I guess, there was some overlap going back. It reinforced that systematic approach, and where an investment process or a risk management process needs to be sort of looked at hand in hand, not just focus on the investment process, which is like, where's the reward, but the risk side of it.
Yeah, I can see how both in trekking and as well as in investing, you've got, there's the logical, rational side, the analysis, the checklists, but there's also so much that's on the emotional side, right? FOMO or fear, greed, right? All of this type of things. Are there certain ways that you found to help you stay disciplined?
I've found some of the most intelligent people I've met in my life in finance make terrible rookie errors when emotions get involved, particularly when you're underwater, right? Particularly when you're facing a loss and then how to deal with that loss. And then when ego gets involved, well, I'm smart and my rationale was really good, but it's not working. At what point do you say enough is enough? And some people just keep doubling down and then dig themselves further into a hole. So look, I struggled with this myself and I worked on it. There's a lot of self-help related stuff that I did. I read many books on investment psychology and I read them with the view of trying to be introspective. Which of these particular aspects of psychology or overconfidence is me? And I tried to understand where my weaknesses were. And then, so I guess it was a boss that I had in New York with Morgan Stanley, Guru Ramakrishnan. And he really grilled me on investment process. And he made me write and rewrite my investment process until it was right. And until I got it right, he wouldn't give me any capital to trade. So, or my capital to trade was going to be peanuts, right?
Yep.
But I couldn't trade big bucks to make big bucks until I satisfied that he was satisfied. And he really made me, and that group really made me think about it. I learned a lot when I was in New York. In fact, I was with a group. At that time, I didn't have a PhD, but in that group, I was the only non-PhD. And half of those PhDs were literally rocket scientists or former rocket scientists. And I learned a lot about quantitative investing at that time, but I learned a hell of a lot about risk management and discipline. But the real lessons you learned are not, if you like, cerebral. They are emotional, to your point. It's how you deal with those emotional fluctuations and trying to learn from those lessons. And I made plenty of mistakes. And you're right, is in investment, emotion is an impediment to intellect. It stops your intellect from working effectively. And once you get emotion involved, it really impacts your performance, certainly in mountaineering, where the consequences can be dire. When emotion gets involved, when you're making decisions about, I want to climb the mountain, or you're so obsessed about, I saw this particularly at Everest, a lot of type A personalities who wanted to do it at any cost. And many people have lost their lives, not just there, but even on much smaller mountains. Actually, there are more people who die on Mont Blanc in Europe each year than they do in Everest, many more, and certainly percentages, many more on a much smaller mountain. So it's also based on people letting their emotions and their desires override common sense and good discipline.
Fascinating, Paul. Thanks for joining us. I want to wrap up with one more question. I'm always trying to encourage our students to not just see the headlines on social media or the headlines in newspapers, but to get behind those. I think reading books is a great way to do that, to spend a bit more time on different ideas and exploring a topic in more depth. What's on your bookshelf? Are there any books that you would recommend to a MBA applicant?
Stuff I've been reading recently has not really been related to economics or finance, to be honest. A lot more on health. So there's a book that I read recently by Anna Lembke called Dopamine Nation. So this is more in the self-help. So this is sort of trying to sort of understand in this world of hyperstimulation, whether it be gaming or your iPhone, or alcohol or whatever, right? Anything that causes it, and helping us sort of understand how the brain works when it's stimulated by pleasure or the anticipation of pleasure, and how this can drain you over time if you overdo that dopamine, and how it can lead to depression and so on and so forth. And it's a very interesting book and explains the science of it, which I need in order to become convinced of this, and it gives lots of practical examples and data and so on. And so I suppose I had some self-reflection about, what were the things that I had a dopamine addiction on. Now, one of them was sugar. I had a sweet tooth. And the other one is my iPhone, okay? Alcohol, those substances, never been an issue for me. Nothing, like gaming, not really. iPhone and sugar. Now, I don't know if you can see, but I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor on my arm right now. That's right there. And I've actually been working with a functional medicine specialist. Perhaps you've seen some of the YouTube videos of Brian Johnson. This is billionaire guy who wants to live forever, what have you. Well, I'm not taking 100 supplements a day, maybe 20 to 30 or thereabouts, but I'm working with someone and looking at sort of, this identifiable thing. And so what he found with me is I'm not diabetic or pre-diabetic or anything like that, but I really, for my general health, getting my fasting glucose level down and keeping it low is important for my generic health. And as it turns out, that means me facing up to my big addiction, which was sugar. So I really that was a challenge, but now it's been over a year and I've lost all those cravings. So having a dopamine detox, I won't go into the details, is actually something that's very, very important. Now, related to this book, so that's Anna Lemke, Dopamine Nation.
Yep. It's going to be on my list.
Okay. Yeah. Second book, Catherine Price, How to Break Up with Your Phone. Okay. Very good. And this gives you practical, actually extremely well written.
Yeah.
Psychologist, extremely well written, relates to the whole dopamine. It's a good read after Dopamine Nation about how you can create systems to get yourself and detach from the phone. And I now track myself on my phone once a week to see what my hour usage is being. And a third one, again, it's not related to economics or finance, but relates to the functional medicine, is Good Energy by Casey Means. Casey Means was actually nominated to be the Surgeon General in the US, but didn't take up the position. This one's super interesting and relates to this functional medicine side. And it goes to the whole issue about health and the health system not actually focusing on preventing ill health, but dealing with ill health once it's already occurred. So the medical profession, big pharma and so on, is focused on treating illness once it occurs. I talked to my brother about this, my brother-in-law, I should say, who's a doctor. 6 years in medical school, 1 hour lecture on nutrition out of the entire 6 years. The focus is not on trying to prevent it. So this book is written by a medical professional who's decided to do empirical work with other like-minded people about what are the factors that lead to better health at the cellular level, even going down to the mitochondrial level. And there are many factors. I mean, good sleep and appropriate nutrition, etc., all good. But the two biggest, I won't spoil it for you, but the two biggest factors are microbiome, so gut health, and second, believe it or not, insulin resistance or blood glucose. Now, in modern society, we eat far more sugar than we did in the past. Okay. And so this is something that all of us need to reduce. So I'm track not every month, but this month I track my blood sugar to make sure that it stays up. Now again, I don't have any chronic disease or anything like that, but you don't need to have chronic disease for this to impact your cellular health. And it leads to high degrees of sugar, lead to insulin resistance that leads to cellular health problems. And, in the extreme, what is a bad acting cell or an unhealthy cell? One that mutates into cancer. It's cancer. It can be heart disease. It can be related to other respiratory diseases. It's a full gamut of it. Really good read. Not an easy read, but a very good read. One that could make a positive influence on your life. That's Good Energy by Casey Means.
And all really relevant to business leaders, investors, MBA students, maintaining that focus, maintaining the energy. We all need really good health to perform at our best, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Paul, for joining us.
My pleasure.
If you are interested in hearing more about Paul's insights on macroeconomics and the world today, please do listen to part A of this podcast interview with Paul. You can also stay tuned for an upcoming masterclass by Paul. We will be hosting this virtually in December. Follow HKUST MBA on LinkedIn, Instagram, WeChat, or RedNote to be the first to hear about how to register for Paul's masterclass.